Good morning, everyone. I hope that everything is okay with you. You have passed the first wave of this crazy weather we're having and bracing for the remaining days this week. So try to keep yourself as warm as possible. And I will be with you here on those links. Um, Before I begin today, just let me put the slides on the screen. There you go. A couple of things before I begin. So quiz one, which was submitted 2 weeks ago, I think. I hope to get the grades as soon as possible. I'm still struggling a little bit with the Canvas grades feature. So that's part of the problem and part of the reason that you don't have the grades yet, but I hope to get them as soon as possible. Quiz two, the link for the second quiz, which relates to readings for next week, for week 6 readings. I've sent you that last night. The instructions are pretty much the same as it was for the first quiz. You have a total of 7 questions. You have to choose 5 of these questions and answer them. Some of them relate directly to one of the readings. Some of them may be combining the reading, but of course they're all related to the 4 articles that you had on the syllabus. So do not forget that you have to submit those by next Sunday night. So do not forget that. One last thing, I also sent you last week, I have posted the assignment for the midterm task on Canvas, and I've attached to it the list of podcast episode. So I encourage you to begin thinking about this thing. You have about a little over 2 weeks until you have to submit that. Make sure that you are choosing the topic that you want. If we haven't got to that topic yet, then you can wait. If you want, you can start listening to the relevant episodes. And if you have any questions about that, as always, you are more than welcome to come to office hours or come to our Friday sessions, and we can talk about that as well. Okay, so a quick review on last week. So last week we finished the discussion about domestic politics and behavior in the international system, the effect of domestic politics. Mostly the bottom line on this entire topic is that decision makers, when they have to face any kinds of decisions when it comes to international systems, such as whether they want to go into conflict, whether they want to send troops to just support a conflict, whether they want to go into international negotiations, whatever the action may be in the international system, they're facing actually dual types of pressure. On the one hand, they face those internal demands from their constituencies. They have to satisfy their supporters, they have to satisfy members of the political system. And on the other thing, they also face the pressure or the demands from other systems, other countries in the international system. So if I want to go into some form of negotiations with China, I also have to accept some of the Chinese demands. So this is an important aspect in that sense, and those dual pressure actually shape the eventual outcome. I talked about Putnam's two-level game theoretical composite helps us understand that, about the Winset, how that affects negotiations. And then we talked about more specific examples, first with the Cook paper, how the government structure affects the duration of the conflict, mostly arguing that governments that are more likely to collapse, such as either left-wing governments, because in most cases they're viewed as incompetent when it comes to security affairs, or governments that has a variety of opinions, which allows those members within the government to maybe form alternative coalitions with members outside the government. All those increase the risk that governments will not survive during conflict. And that leads, or that provides to those specific types of government incentives to end the conflict as soon as possible. So that was one finding showing the effect of the domestic effects on an international event, in this case, conflict. And then we talked about the effects of public opinion and, again, government structure when it comes to the decision to engage in conflict, with the examples from the Orsfield paper, mostly talking about the Suez crisis, but there's other crises involved as well. But what we were able to see mostly in this case is the difference between the government structure of the United States and the UK and the French, and how those different domestic institutions had different effects on what was essentially the same decision by those political leaders in those countries not to engage in a military intervention. In the case of the Suez crisis, eventually Israel solved the problem for everyone on some level. Okay, if you have any questions about those topics, you have any questions about those articles, as always, you are more than welcome to email me or come talk to me about this during office hours. Today, we're beginning a new topic. The first topic that we talk about today is the theory of rational choice. Rational choice theory is not just a theory of IR. It's mostly can be used or can be viewed as an analytic tool that helps us formulate IR theories. Our rational choice theory is a general theory to describe the way we should make decisions. Both liberalism, which I talked about last week, as well as neoliberalism, which I talked in previous weeks, both of them rely heavily on the rational choice framework. I'll begin with some basics of the rational choice theory, how it fits within the research of IR, and then I'll discuss some applications of this tool to expand the most predominant events in our field in international politics, especially revolving around international conflicts and wars. So in terms of a definition for rationality, this is a process in which we set objectives and then we examine all or as much as possible of the available alternatives to achieve those objectives. A rational decision in this case is selecting the alternatives that's going to maximize our expected utility with regard to those objectives. So there's different types of ways that we can reach those objectives. We are assessing all of them, and we are selecting the one that's going to provide us the highest relative utility with respect to our objective. In terms of the decision-making process, each individual will assess the costs, the benefits, and the risks of implementing each of those alternatives in order to accomplish the goal. Now, this is where it comes interesting in a sense of how is that affects other decision makers, not just myself, because all actors are pursuing these actions. So if I'm representing the United States, I'm pursuing this kind of process, but actors that represent Canada, that represent China, that represent Russia, whatever that may be, all of us are going through the same process. Then what happens is there is a kind of an emergence for a strategic behavior. We also account for the expected behavior of our rival. So when I'm assessing an alternative in order to accomplish my objective in this upcoming negotiations with Canada, I'm also assessing the potential behavior that Canada or the potential requirements or the demands that the Canadian representatives are going to present in front of me. That shapes the evaluation of all the possible alternatives and the eventual selection of any kind of alternative, in this case, a policy action. Rational choice has a dynamic nature. In what sense? The model suggests, or when we are engaged in rational decision-making, is that we constantly collect information from the environment and reassess our choices. If the feedback that we get from the environment for the choices that we made suggests that our behavior is not leading to the expected outcome, so that's essentially an inefficient behavior. We decided to choose an alternative which is inefficient to accomplish our objective, then we should update our behavior. In this case, we alter our behavior in order to achieve the highest possible utility with respect to our preferences. So we should change our behavior based on the feedback we get from the environment. This is a rational dynamic updating. The main, just a minute, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so what are the main advantages of the rational choice model overall when it comes to decision making? And it has its own specific applications when it comes to IR. The prime benefit is a parsimony and simplicity. So we are viewing any type of behavior, any type of choice as calculated, purposeful, and with the intention to accomplish very clear goals by paying the minimum cost. So it provides us a very simple way to think about the behavior that we engaged in. This is also a simple framework which produces clear observable implications that are common among many types of cases, which essentially suggest that it's easier to generalize. And that's why rational choice is viewed as a model that provides us a general explanation of behavior, because we're not addressing specific type of choices, but we're looking at the choices overall as we have this clear framework that explains to us how do we get to those choices that we made. And then we can generalize and we can assess both the decision by political decision makers who engages in negotiations in the international system, as well as political decision makers who engage in any kind of choices in the domestic sector, as well as the decision by the simple citizens who decides how he's going to decide, how he's going to vote to each party he wants to vote, just as an example. So this is a very general framework. Now, despite those descriptive simplicity and advantages, there are several limitations for this framework. Overall, the main thing we can think about is that in reality, the description of rational choice and the description of the rational choice process is kind of problematic because humans have a lot of limitations, especially on their cognitive capacity, and we cannot assess an infinite amount of information. So remind you again, the idea of the rational choice process is that we have some objectives and we're estimating all possible alternatives to reach that objective. In reality, we don't have the capacity to deal with that and to actually assess, I don't know, 25 different alternatives to accomplish some goal that we have. So this is one limitation. Also, we have a very hard struggle to deal with the uncertainty that reality poses, especially in the context of international politics. We don't really have, especially as citizens or as individuals who are members of the political system and not necessarily policymakers, we don't have all the information about what's happening in international politics. So if we need to get to a decision which is supposed to be a rational choice, it's very hard to do that because we cannot deal with all this uncertainty. We don't really know what everybody else thinks. Another constraint on our rationality is that our assessment in most cases is not is not dispassionate and is mostly affected by psychological elements such as emotions, which is just a small touch in this topic. We'll talk about it a lot more next week when we talk about political psychology. But those kinds of cognitive limitations, whether they are what's called cold cognitive limitations, which is our limited cognitive capacity, or hot cognition, which is emotions, all those limitations lead individuals to make decisions that are not really maximizing their preferences. That's the main idea. In reality, we're not following this formula which says that any choice we make according to the rational choice model, we're maximizing our utility. In reality, we are not. That's where we can think about the main theory that provided us it's not really the alternative, but showed us how limited our ability to process information and to reach a rational decision. That's what's called the bounded rationality, which was introduced by Herbert Simon. It's part of the whole theory, and it's a term used to describe our incapability to make pure rational choices because of our different cognitive limitations, as well as the fact that we have to deal with imperfect information. And that leads to what's called, in many cases, satisficing behavior. So satisficing in really 2 seconds is the fact that if rational choice tells us that we will assess all alternatives before making a choice, satisficing behavior means that we have some objective, whatever the objective is. We're going to assess, let's say, 2 or 3 options, something like that. And if we'll find one alternative is going to be enough for us, we'll be satisfied with that and just stop there and decide that this is what we want to do. We're not going to really go through the entire list. So how do we apply the rational choice model in the context of IR? The rational perspective to IR views actors' behavior as intended to benefit their own interests. So every country tries to promote her own interest, and the outcome is actually a result of a bargaining between 2 or more actors, each trying to maximize her own objective. So in this case, again, trying to choose a path of action, a policy, which will provide the highest possible utility with respect to every country's objectives. So under this prism, and this is what you will see now on the screen, every political interaction is viewed as a game in which every relevant actor will behave in a way that best accomplishes their goals. At the same time, every actor will also assess or estimate other actors' expected actions. So the figures that you have here on the screen is just an example. And this is a game between one actor, which is, as you can see here, is the government. And on the other hand, this is terrorist or terror group or whatever that may be. Each one of them has expected benefits, and we are measuring that with different variables here, which provide us with the expected benefits and expected costs from different types of behavior, as well as different path of action. So the government can choose to behave by accepting some offer, by providing some alternative here, or providing some alternative here, and the terrorists by themselves are based on the offer made by the government can decide to accept this or reject that. But this is just a general way to describe it. This is a very strategic setup of investigating the behavior of the main actors. Right? So this is how a lot of research which uses rational choice is displayed from a visual standpoint, because that's allow us to think about, well, this is the situation in reality, and this is the government as one actor. The government can decide to do that or decided to do that, and then it has different types of costs and benefits out of it. Okay, so rational choice theory is based on a list of assumptions which are very simple, and again, just like assumptions in any other theory that I've talked about beforehand, is intended to simplify the reality. So let's talk about those assumptions. Number one is what's called, according to rational choice, we are agnostic about preferences. What exactly does that mean? We are viewing preferences as given. Every actor that we have to deal with. Every decision maker that we are dealing with has some preferences, and we don't really care where those preferences are coming from. Any actor has those preferences. We do not question the origin. We do not question the rationality. We do not question the ethics or the appropriateness or the soundness of each of those uh, preferences. We do not even have to agree with the preferences in order to accept that. And one clear example to that is the fact that, just like I had in the previous slide, terrorism. So suicide terrorist has some preferences. There are some research, there's a lot of research in political science which provide rational explanation for the decision to kill yourself in order to promote some goal. And this is a preference. We do not, when we're thinking about it from a rational standpoint, we do not question how much more the morality of this kind of decision, how much it makes sense to us or not. It does not matter to us if we are deciding to engage in this kind of an analysis. Okay, and this is a very important assumption to understand. We accept that everyone has preferences. It doesn't matter where they come from. The next three assumptions, which you have here, 2, 3, and 4, are related to the preferences themselves. So actors' preferences are ranked in terms of their level of satisfying desired outcomes. So we can have 3 different preferences because we want to accomplish some objective. So we have 3 different types of outcomes that we are trying to accomplish. We will try to accomplish the most preferred outcome, but a rational actor may accept suboptimal outcomes, so not the number one preference or the number one outcome that we want, rather than accepting the least preferred outcome. So if we are a rebel group who's trying to accomplish independence for the people that we decided to represent, we can have 3 potential outcomes. We can have the most desired outcome for us is actually being able to secure independence from the country that controls this territory. Our second preferred outcome is securing negotiations and some kind of an autonomy. And our third the third outcomes that we are trying to accomplish is to have international recognition. Now, overall, we'll do everything we can in order to accomplish the number one goal, securing this independence from the country that controls this territory. But it is a rational decision on the rebel groups' end to accept just autonomy in that territory instead of just not accepting everything and eventually having to accept any kind of less accepted, less higher preference in this case. So accepting just international recognition. If we can accept autonomy, we should go for that preference. The third assumption is that preferences are transitive, which means that if preference A is better than preference B for us, which is better than preference C, then that means that preference A is also better than preference C. So again, just the order and the basics transitive property like we have in math. Number 4 is preferences are stable over time. Preferences will not change as time passes. They will remain stable. The behavior in which we're engaging in trying to accomplish them it may change. Why? Because as I talked a few slides ago when I talked about dynamic updating, we may change our behavior based on the feedback from the environment. But again, overall, the objective will still be trying to accomplish our preferred outcomes. We'll just change the way that we act in order to accomplish that. The last assumption here you're already familiar with because I talked about it in previous lectures, the unitary actor assumptions. Actors are viewed as a single entity. States or organizations such as rebel groups or terror organizations are seen as a single actor that makes decisions about pursuing certain goals. Any entity operates as a whole regardless of its internal composition, and any internal conflict about the preferences are just simplified using these assumptions and are not taken as part of the decision process. By relying on those very relatively straightforward assumptions, all of them by design oversimplifying reality, we can employ the tools of formal models, which is similar to the figure that I had on the screen a few slides ago, in order to theorize about the behavior of the different actors and produce very clear and testable implications for the analysis. Despite the fact that they are relatively oversimplifying reality, those assumptions still provide us with the internal consistency, to the framework of thinking about the entire behavior of the decision maker in this context of a rational behavior. Therefore, it provides a much stronger appeal for this theory as viewing that as a general theory of behavior. So those assumptions are very, very simplistic when it comes to the way they view reality, but they provide us with this internal consistency, which provides a lot of strength for the theory to explain in general the behavior of both policymakers in the international system, as well as the average citizen who wants to decide who he or she wants to vote for. And finally, the simplicity of this kind of framework allows analysts to estimate the value of a various objectives for actors, therefore generating predictions about their expected choices. It's also very appealing to policymakers because it distills very complex reality or very complex political problems into clear representations that yield a clear set of policy responses to any type of scenario, along with their expected chances of success. When we derive, based on those kinds of frameworks, we build those models and provide expected chances of success for any kind of alternatives that we can engage in order to accomplish those objectives. This is very appealing for policymakers because they like to have those kinds of very clear ways to think about that. All right, so this is the introduction for rational choice theory overall. And now I want to discuss about several applications, especially when it comes to IR. The main question that I want to address here is can we explain the decision to engage in war and fit that into this framework, which says, yes, it is a rational decision to engage in war. So let's talk about that. So this discussion will be based, of course, on the paper that you had for today from Professor James Fearon. It's one of the most famous papers when it comes to applying this rational choice framework into the decisions to engage in war. We begin by thinking about what is the appeal of using the rational choice approach to explain conflicts or war. So there's two aspects to that. First of all, past work tended to focus on specific conflicts and show that war was the rational option for leaders. They tried to promote their state's interests. So they looked at specific conflicts, analyzed those conflicts, and came to the conclusion that, yes, engaging in war, engaging in conflict, in aggressive military action was a rational choice in order to accomplish those specific goals. So in that sense, it has been done in the past, looking at more specific types of options of leaders that estimated their expected benefits, and those were outweighing the cost of war, so they decided to engage in war. The second point here is that, building on the neorealism mostly, the rational approach to war views the causes as lying within the international system and not the defects within the particular leader. So again, this provides us a more general way to think about why do states engage in war. It's not that leaders, specific leaders, had their own defects or their own biases which led them to decide to engage in war. It was more of international system conditions. So again, using the rational choice approach, which provides us, as I said earlier, a general framework to think about behavior, is very, very appealing. Fearon's work offers us a general framework to understand why war may be a rational choice. This is a framework that is both theoretically relevant as well as empirically plausible. And I'm sorry about that. Overall, he talks about three clusters of explanations. One is thinking about leaders as irrational. Another one looks at the idea that leaders enjoy the benefits of war without paying the cost. So why do leaders decide to go to wars? Because they will enjoy the benefits if they are able to win the war. And they're not going to pay a lot of cost because they're in themselves, especially modern leaders, are not going to the battlefield. They're sending the military. So they will not actually pay the war. So those are two clusters of explanations, but he rejects them, and he focuses on a third cluster again in his work, suggesting that there is a set of rational arguments according to which leaders will assess the benefits and the cost of war and decide to engage in that anyway. And what I want to focus on is that beginning by talking first of all about the main point that Fearon makes as he begins his analysis, that there can be many rational arguments to explain war, whether it is the fact that the international system is an anarchy, whether it is the states have to engage in this self-help, so they have to promote their own objective, and everything talked about in realism, whether it is failures in deterrence, whether it is different incentive due to alliance formation, whatever the explanation may be. None of those explanations account for the most basic point, and that's what you have on the screen here at the bottom. Wars are costly and risky, so if you are truly a rational actor, you should be able to locate what's called negotiated settlement with your adversary prior to engaging in violence. In every kind of interaction that one state has with another state, if the leaders are indeed rational actors, they should be able to locate any kind of settlement instead of going to war. And the rational account for war has to explain why leaders fail to reach such settlements and they favor the costs of war instead of trying to find the benefits of not going into war. So before going into specific explanations provide us why do leaders decide to make those kinds of choices, why do leaders prefer the cost and the risk of war instead of finding those bargain solutions, Fearon spends a lot of time talking about why should wars overall, when thinking about it from a rational standpoint, why wars should not be pursued. And that goes around the concept of what's called the bargaining range. Now, this is a part which, if you read the paper, it was maybe a little bit confusing. I'm going to try to simplify that by providing you some of the basics of this argument and trying to show you how the Fearon provides with the most basic argument that wars are not an efficient solution to any kind of disagreement between actors. The bargaining range, as it is, the way that we can think about it from a definitional standpoint, is a range of outcomes that both rational actors should accept instead of war. So let's think about an example. Let's think about two states with a set of preferences which we can describe them on that interval here between 0 and 1. So we can take two nations and those set of preferences. If you want to take a more clear example that allow us to explain what it is, let's think about this interval between 0 and 1 as territory. So country A will be placed in this side, and country A wants to have all the territory to itself. So for country A, the most favorite outcome, just like you see here on the screen, is this point, having all the territory. Country B will sit in this point and will prefer also the entire territory. So that's going to be its most favorite outcome. Now, if the state decides to engage in war in order to resolve that conflict, then there is an overall some probability P, which can be, of course, any number between 0 and 1, that in which country A is going to win. And there's the probability of 1 minus P that country B is going to win. And the basic set of conditions for the war is whoever wins the war, if they decide to engage in that, essentially, will get all the territory. So if A stands here, decides to win the war, and decides to engage in the war, it has the probability of P of winning. And if A wins the war, A gets the entire preference, in this case, the entire territory. Now, there's a lot of math that are involved in this analysis within that, but there's a couple of more things that we need to understand about this point. We have this point P minus CA and P plus CB, which are the value of war for each one of those actors, because there are some costs that are being paid for war. So if A decides to go to war, this is the value, this point here, all that small interval here within the overall interval, which is the value that A has to war. And again, B wants this entire area, but this is the value that B has for war. So everything that falls, anything that falls to the right of this point, B will prefer to go to war. So the idea behind that, and the way to think about this bargaining range, is that this provides us with a range of outcomes or a range of solutions for the conflict between them. So let's say that they decide to engage in some kind of bargaining before they actually decide to go to war. And country A will say, well, we want this solution. We will get all this, and country B will get this part. Now, because of what we saw here, that this is B's value for war, and B's value for war will be larger than the value that A is offering, B is better off going to war, right? That's the idea behind it. But the main point we have to think about when thinking about the bargaining range, right? So those are multiple solutions that offer to those two actors, A and B, more utility than war. This is the bargaining range. And this is all the options that we have between those 2 points, what you see here. Why? Let's take an example, again, country A. If they are deciding to go in some kind of negotiations, country A and B will say, okay, so our solution is here. You will get A will get all this part and B will get all this part. Now, this is more than B will get from the war, so B should take that. It is also more than what A should get from the war, so A should take that. If one of the actors decides to reject this offer and they go to war, then they're risking themselves in losing the entire territory. And even if we're not thinking about the risk of losing the entire territory, their value for war is smaller than the offer for both of them. That's the idea behind it. All those points are better offer for either A or B than going to war. The example that we have here is this point X, which is this is A's value for this outcome. And again, it's more than the value to war for A. It's a lot more than the value to war for B. So both of them should be able to accept that. And that's the idea behind the bargaining range. And in essence, what the bargaining range leads us to is that there is cost and risk of conflict. And those are kind of opening this wedge of bargain solutions that for leaders who are risk neutral or risk averse, they will prefer that to the gamble of conflict. Okay, so essentially what we understand from this bargaining range discussion is that rational actors should be able to find an acceptance bargain than going to war. It's very likely that in the vast majority of situations, rational actors should be able to solve the differences without going to war. Still, why do we actually go to war? And can we provide a rational explanation to that? What the way that Fearon calls that, and now we'll talk about the first one, it doesn't call it a rational explanation to war, it calls it rationalist, because this is how we add this rational choice element into explaining why do countries go to war. Okay, so the first set of explanation is described as what's called private information and misrepresentation. The common rationales for wars are miscalculations due to overestimations of power or of willingness to fight, lack of information about my rival's willingness to fight. And again, coming back to explaining why wars should not happen, Fearon argues that those explanations, while some of them may have some validity, they miss the fact that states should be able to communicate with one another and avoid those potential explanations. So saying that I was miscalculating or overestimating the power of my rival is not enough of an explanation to why I decided to engage in war, because I should have been able to contact that rival and provide them with this information and learn from that rival how powerful it is and whether actually we should go to war. Instead, the focus should be, according to what Fearon suggests, is on the incentives that some leaders have to misrepresent my position and why actually I cannot fix that even with diplomacy. Two options to how actors can rationally miscalculate the power relations amongst themselves. One is emotional commitment that will bias the rational leader's assessment. The other is the assessment by any kind of professionals or analysts that says that the capabilities of my own countries are stronger than my adversaries. However, there is a third option here, and that option argues that leaders may hold some private information about their own military or strategic capabilities, and they would like to hide that information, not allow the adversary to know about that information, and that's going to skew their expected result, make them more likely to believe that they are more likely to win. I think I have any kind of secret capabilities militarily that my rival is not aware of. I do not want my rival to learn about that, and I believe because of that information that I'm more likely to win in the war. So I have incentives to go to both misrepresent the information and not reveal this information to my rival, as well as going to conflict with that rival because I think I'm going to win. I have that additional power. Now, from thinking about it from another aspect where this misrepresentation may lead to war is when the information or the private information exists regarding the issues at stake. If I believe that the issue at stake, this territory that I had the example here for A and B, is I believe that it's much more important for me than to my rival, then it might skew my assessment about how likely I am to win the war. If an actor does not know of the value of this issue to my adversary, how willing he is to fight, I may decide to initiate war because I believe that I'm more likely to win. So let's talk about some of those incentives to misrepresent my own capabilities or my own intentions. So there's three incentives in this case that leads to that. First, if I'm going to war, I want to enjoy the benefits and get as much as possible from that war. Therefore, I have incentives to exaggerate my willingness or my capabilities to fight, hoping that that's going to create a deterrence for my rival and persuade my rival to make concessions. So if I will misrepresent my information and present myself as much more willing to fight or much more powerful than I really am, then I may create deterrence to my rival, which will say, okay, so let's not go to war. I will provide you concessions. Another incentive in this case is that if I'm concerned that revealing my true capabilities or my true level of resolve will make me look weaker, both from a military standpoint as well as from a political standpoint. And that may also harm the odds of a successful war. So again, another incentive for me to uh, reveal my true capabilities, it's provide actually I have incentive to misrepresent the information about my capabilities of my intention to war. The third point here is the states may conceal their true willingness to war in order to avoid appearing as an aggressor. I don't want to be viewed internationally as I was the aggressor that initiated the war, so I'm concealing my true willingness to fight, and I'm misrepresenting this information. Now, if we combine any one of those incentives, or some of those incentives, more than one, along with the fact that states essentially may really have private information, that provides us what Fearon calls a rational explanation to why leaders may miscalculate and decide to go to wars. As an example, let's go back to 1914 and the beginning of the First World War, which can be explained on some level based on this explanation, private information, incentive to misrepresent. The crisis in July 14 involved Austria, involved Germany, involved Russia and the United Kingdom. The Germans had clear misincentives to represent their intentions of supporting Austria in the conflict, in the crisis that emerged at the time, because they did not want to appear as the aggressor, because they really wanted to reduce any kind of British concerns about going to war. And what those incentives and the behavior of Germany led at the time was that the British response to the crisis was much weaker and contributed to the escalation of the crisis. When both sides, the German side and the British side, were finally able to reveal their true intentions in this situation, it was already too late to reduce the tensions and the war on. Therefore, the incentives that they have to misrepresent, beginning with the Germans at the time, and possessing this private information, the Germans were much more willing to go to war to support Austria than they were willing to tell other members of the crisis. And that led some actors to send this costly signal, which led to the mobilization of troops by the Russians at the time. It increased the risk for an inefficient war, and they were unable to find a better solution to that. So again, those incentives for misrepresentation were one of the first steps that led to the escalation of the crisis, the inappropriate behavior by the British, which did not deter the Germans from further pursuing the conflict and eventually to the war. So this is just one example for this explanation. Now, the other explanation that Fearon discusses is what's called commitment problem. These are structural conditions that create incentives for some states to renege on an efficient bargain outcome in attack. And as a result, it creates a rational logic for the rivals of those actors to initiate a preemptive attack or preemptive war. The basic logic of this mechanism is that one actor has offensive advantage over her rival, then this actor has incentives to attack and reap the benefits of victory. Because the international system is based on an anarchy, then that complicates this scenario because there's no central authority who's going to enforce the bargains, and that makes reneging on agreement much easier to pull off. So in the United States and Mexico has some kind of settlement in order to solve their differences, because the United States is a lot more powerful, right? So it has incentives to renege on this agreement and actually go to conflict and take whatever it wants from Mexico. That's the idea behind that. And we talked about that when I talked about realism, neorealism, and power transition theory. And we add that, but the place that we add this rational explanation to war is that this kind of scenario where one actor has incentives to renege on an agreement and reap the benefits because it's more powerful, that presents the rational logic for preventative wars. Let's think about, again, as an example, about two actors. Let's not think about United States and Mexico, because I'm not sure it's going to provide you some. It might be a little bit confusing, but let's consider two actors who are interacting over a long period of time, and overall war is still viewed as an inefficient outcome, and those two actors should be able to locate a peaceful solution to their differences. Okay, so they have kind of peaceful solution at the time. However, because there's a no third party that's going to enforce the agreement, if one of those two actors becomes more powerful than the other, then again, this actor has incentives to go back on the agreement and attack the weaker rival. Now, because of those conditions, the other actor, let's call this actor B, which is the declining state, will actually prefer war in the current period than the less efficient bargain it will be able to settle for an attack after an attack by actor A, which is the rising power. So essentially, actor B views the cost of war now as much lower compared to its decline in the future, and therefore accepting a less favorable solution. And that creates to this country B a rational incentives to initiate a preemptive attack. What Fearon suggests in his paper is saying that contradictory to this is from page 406, I just put it down for myself, and I think it summarizes this point pretty nicely, is that contrary to standard formulation, the declining state, which we called country B in our example, the attack that this state decides to engage in is not because it fears being attacked in the future. Country B, in this case, the declining state, is not concerned about being attacked in the future from country A, the rising power, but it decides to engage in this preemptive war because it fears that the peace it will have to accept in the future after its rival, country A, will be much stronger, is not as good as it may be able to accomplish now. That provides us, again, with rational incentives to engage in a preventative war or a preemptive attack because of my fear of how my rival is going to behave in the future. So the fear of future outcomes in this explanation is not because of private information, which was the previous explanation, but because of the structural conditions that provide those opportunities for one actor to renege on an existing bargain. And the example in this case is, again, we go back to the great year of 1914. And in this case, when thinking about the interactions between the Germans and the Russians in the crisis that led to World War I, the Germans preferred to go to war in 1914 because they were very concerned about the Russian constant growth in their power, which they were concerned will have negative implications in terms of the Russians exerting an influence in Europe, especially in the Balkans, and of course, the case of future wars. So for the Germans, because they were concerned that Russia is getting stronger and stronger at the time, they preferred to go to war in 1914 and accept the cost of war in 1914 than having to go to war with Russia in, I don't know, 1919 and accepting the eventual outcome of that war, right? That's the idea behind the commitment problem as another set of structural conditions which provide us with rational incentives to engage in conflict or to engage in war. So this is the bottom, some of the main points that Fearon has provided in his paper. And now I want to talk about another example of applying the principle of rational choice to the questions of conflict behavior. We do that with the second paper that you had, another paper that you had for this week, and this is the Furman and Sesher paper. From the rationality perspective, the topic that they highlight is the commitment problem. So this is kind of the second mechanism that Fearon talked about, and the type of actions that states can employ to overcome or reduce the effects of those commitment problems. The authors focus in terms of the type of interactions they're talking about is on alliance commitment, and especially for nuclear powers. The idea is, can nuclear powers deter attacks against their allies by simply announcing their defense commitments, or do they have to deploy weapons to signal their commitment? So again, nuclear powers which provide any kind of defense commitment to their allies are trying to prevent some rival of that ally from attacking it by providing this kind of verbal alliance. But we'll get to that. The main challenge in this case is based on the difficulty to convince adversaries that a state, a powerful nuclear state, will not renege on its defense commitment and is willing to pay the conflict cost if one of its allies is attacked. Let's think about, as an example, if the United States, let's say for an example, has a defense commitment to Ukraine. The United States is a nuclear power, it has defense commitment with the Ukraine. Now, the adversary of Ukraine, in this case Russia, decides to send military forces into the territory of the Ukraine. The question in this case, and this is where the commitment mechanism comes into play, does the United States keep its promise, keep its alliance, and will enter the conflict and intervene if necessary with military forces and accept the paying cost of this conflict or not. And that's the main point in this case. The authors talk about two types of signals that can be used in order to prevent adversary from attacking allies. One is a public declaration of defense to defend, so the public declaration to defend an ally. The other one is taking a more clear step of demonstrating the commitment by deploying troops in that area. So again, if we stay with the example of the United States and Ukraine, one possibility for the United States in order to declare its seriousness to the alliance is to make a public declaration that they will defend Ukraine against any kind of external intervention. Another option is to send troops into Ukraine. The vast majority of defense pacts that were signed over the last 60 years had few signals of commitment beyond just a verbal promise, and you'll see here a couple of examples. So the United States commitment to the Rio Pact has been mostly a verbal promise, as well as the Soviets' commitment to Finland during the Cold War, and the way that most of the members of the Arab League are committed to one another in terms of helping them in terms of attack are mostly verbal commitment. For the United States, many of its defense pact are based on those verbal commitments, and very few of them had actually stationed troops. Now, why is this an important mechanism? So let's see about that. A verbal commitment, a public verbal commitment, is more likely to be useful if it is made public. Why? Because such a declaration to defend an ally or a protege present a risk for reputational costs for the patron in case of reneging on the pact. This represents what's called the hands-tying commitment device. The objective is the signal. The objective of making this public declaration of the alliance, right, is to manipulate the sender's future payoffs, what's called. So I'm intended to manipulate the cost for the country that makes this public declaration. The signal itself, making the alliance public, is not costly to send for the United States, if this is our example. The cost will be if the United States will not upheld to its commitment. That's the idea behind it. If the United States make a public declaration, they will defend the Ukraine if it's going to be attacked by external forces, and eventually those external forces decide to attack the Ukraine, and the United States does not intervene in the conflict, then the United States played substantial credibility and reputational cost. Okay? So a public alliance commitment places the patrons, United States in this case, the credibility at risk, and makes reneging on the agreement much less attractive. Now, the benefits of this kinds of mechanism, especially for nuclear states, is that it's likely to generate what's called extended deterrence benefits because they have those nuclear powers. So if the United States makes this kind of declaration, then the adversary of, again, Ukraine in this example, is much more concerned about attacking the Ukraine because the United States is a nuclear power. Another example we can think about, maybe more realistic for what's happening in the world today, is North and South Korea. So if the United States sends a signal that they will defend South Korea in case of an attack by North Korea, then that represents a very strong signal for North Korea that they should not actually attack the South, because the United States is also a nuclear power. So they may face the risk of a nuclear retaliation from the United States in situation where they decide to attack South Korea. Okay, before going into the last part of this specific paper, I will start for today's attendance word. The attendance word for today is the word university. University is the attendance word for today. So the authors test in their paper two propositions. First, arguing that having a public defense pact with a nuclear state reduces the likelihood of being targeted in a military attack. So again, if we stay with the example of, let's stay with North Korea because it's easier. South Korea having a public defense pact with the United States reduces the probability that South Korea will face a military conflict. It's less in a risk of being in a conflict. Another version of this commitment requires more than a verbal act, and that's stationing troops. We'll get to that in a second. The second proposition is that having nuclear powers, nuclear forces on a protege's territory, so having American military forces with nuclear capabilities in South Korea reduces the likelihood of this country going into a conflict. And the question that we can think about is, how does having nuclear forces will make the alliance commitment much stronger. First, it's going to change the balance of power in favor of the ally and probably will prevent or stall any kind of an attack. The historical example in this case is that US having its troops and tactical nuclear weapons in Europe during the Cold War has changed the balance of power between those countries in Europe and prevented any kind of attack from their rivals. A second point in this case is what's called the tripwire strategy. If an adversary decides to attack the country in which the United States tries to defend, they are also likely to target and harm the nuclear powers of the United States, and therefore only lead to escalation and full American intervention. If the United States places troops in, again, Ukraine, for example, and the Russians decides to go into Ukraine and they will also attack and harm American forces, they will actually trigger this tripwire and increase the probability the United States will have to be engaged fully in this conflict. So that is intended to prevent the Russians from attacking the Ukrainian in this case. The third point is that having nuclear forces in place signals resolve, because sending military troops or nuclear forces into another area of deployment has its own set of associated costs. Some of them are economic, some of them political. But if the United States decides to send its troops or its nuclear forces and station them in the Ukraine in this example, again, it signals that it's going to be resolved. It's going to take this alliance seriously. So the authors test both of those. This is some of the defense pacts that they are testing in their analysis, right? So we have your example for a defense pact between the United States and Belgium during the second half of the 20th century, including a defense pact. We have here between the Soviet Union and Cuba, which was during 1962. Just a minute. All right, sorry about that last break. I'm also recording a lecture, but also staying with the kids, so I had to stop for some kind of a mini crisis, but everything's okay. So again, this is a list of some of those examples that they test in their analysis. What are the main findings that they provide us? They provide support for the first proposition, suggesting that having a public defense pact with a nuclear power reduces the probability that the protege will face a military conflict. They do not find support for the second proposition. So they do not find support for the argument that placing nuclear troops in the protege's territory reduces the likelihood. What do we have here? We have their findings regarding, especially for the second proposition. On the y-axis here, we have the rate of fatal of casualties in this case in conflicts. And here we have three different possibilities on the x-axis. This is targeted that never hosted foreign nuclear weapons. And here we have targets that did host in the years that they were deployed, and they're not. And what we see here is that higher values suggest that there's more fatalities from a conflict, or more potential fatalities from a conflict, whether you have nuclear, whether the protege deploys the nuclear troops in the territory or not. And what we see here is that while we have some differences here, they're all very close here. There's not much difference between having conflict cost when you do not even host any kind of nuclear weapons, foreign nuclear weapons in your territory, compared to hosting them and not deployment. And even in deployment here we have some difference between them, but they find in the paper that from a statistical standpoint, there's no difference between those two. And even from a substantive faith standpoint, those differences are very, very small. This is about 0.25. This is almost about 0.20. So again, those differences are very, very small. And that leads to some of the main implications that they offer is, first of all, arguing that hands tying by signaling alliance commitment. So publicly sending a verbal signal of commitment to the alliance, which also, of course, triggers the prospect of reputation cost, is a useful mechanism to reduce the likelihood of crisis emerging. So if the United States makes a public declaration about its commitment to defend South Korea, it reduces substantially the likelihood that North Korea will attack South Korea, or any other country for that matter. In the nuclear context, alliances provide credible signals and enhances the deterrence of aggression. So especially having the support of a nuclear power increases that probability. They also suggest, of course, that placing nuclear weapons to deter aggression in some location is not highly likely to be useful. And the alternative benefits that they suggest for hosting US nuclear forces is that it reduces the host nation's motivation to develop such tools. So the argument in this case is that why, despite the fact that it's not very useful to place American nuclear forces in South Korea, in terms of it's not the research shows it's not very useful in terms of preventing the North Korea from attacking, but it can be useful because it's going to reduce the motivations for South Korea to engage in kind of development of its own nuclear capabilities. That's the argument in this case. Okay, so if you want to read more about this topic, it's a very vast topic which has a lot of research on that. You're more than welcome to go to those papers or other papers. On Wednesday, we'll talk about another kind of theoretical framework which helps us explain international relations. And I hope you will try to keep yourself safe in this kind of crazy weather we're experiencing this week. And if you have any issues, you are more than welcome to join me in office hours tomorrow and on Wednesday, depending on your section, or send me any email for any questions you may have. With that, I am done for today, and I will see you on Wednesday. Bye, everyone.